Hi, my name's Margaret. I'm an English language teacher and a teacher trainer, as well as a dyslexia specialist tutor and assessor. I've been teaching English for almost 30 years in lots of different contexts and several different countries. But the one thing that all of my classes have had in common is a degree of diversity within the group. And today I want to talk a little bit about the neurodiversity and how we can include learners who process information in different ways. I find the term neurodiversity actually quite useful because it recognises all forms of learning differences like dyslexia, ADHD, autism. And it also recognises the complexity of how these specific learning differences co-occur and interact. Some of our learners may have been identified as having a specific learning difference before we meet them, but many of them will never have been assessed. So as language teachers, it may be that we are the first to pick up on their different ways of learning. And so it's really important that we are prepared to accommodate all of our learners in all of our classes. Now I know that might sound a bit daunting, but today I'm going to talk about some very simple things that we can do in the classroom to make our teaching more inclusive. And these are things that won't take up a lot of time and they won't cost a lot of money. Just simple things that make our classrooms easier places for our students to learn. And that's really important to remember. When we talk about inclusive teaching, we're not just concerned with the students who may have a specific learning difference, but with creating a classroom culture in which everybody feels equally valued and motivated. And the foundation of this is really getting to know our learners and encouraging them to get to know each other and perhaps most importantly themselves. So if you forget everything else from this talk, please remember that the basis of good inclusive practice is good relationships. So I'm going to divide the talk into three main sections. First, we're going to consider some practical things that we can do in the classroom, looking at the physical environment and the classroom materials. Secondly, I'll suggest some subtle ways that teachers can influence the culture of the classroom and help students themselves to make changes to the way that they work independently. And then thirdly, I'll say something briefly about the wider educational environment in which we're working and the role of teachers in developing a more inclusive education system. So let's start with what teachers can do practically. We may not have much control over the content of what we teach or where we teach, but there are some aspects of the physical environment that we should be aware of and try to manage. Some neurodiverse students may be more sensitive to their surroundings than their peers, particularly in terms of temperature, light and noise. So for us, a warm room may be okay, but for others it may be unbearably hot. And the bright lights might cause headaches, even visual distortions for some learners. And for some students, what we consider the buzz of a working classroom might be distracting and even distressing. So for some students, it might be worth suggesting that they wear headphones or earphones with some quiet music playing just to block out the distracting sounds. Similarly, too much visual information can be overwhelming for some students, and it's great to have colourful displays on your walls showing off the students' work. But if possible, try to keep the wall around the screen or the board clear of other material, so that students can just focus on what you want them to see at that moment in time. And think about the colours that you're using on the board or the screen. Try to reduce the visual stress by using a shaded background and perhaps choosing text which is not just harsh black. In textbooks, we can use coloured overlays to reduce the contrast between it's usually white paper and black text. But often in textbooks what we find is that it's not just the colour but the actual layout of the page with a lot of pictures and bits of text. So in that situation we might want to use what we call a text window. It's just very simple, 2 L-shaped pieces of card that we can put on the paper just to block out what's not needed so that the student just focuses on one thing at a time. Very simple technology, but actually quite effective for some students. Every instruction that we give needs to be absolutely clear and unambiguous, because remember, if there are any other possible ways of interpreting what you say, your neurodiverse learners will find them and act on them. The same is true of when you give feedback. What I like to do is to find something positive to say, perhaps praise the student for the progress that I can see. And then just choose one or two things to focus on. We don't have to pick up on every single error that they've made. But whatever we do highlight, we should make sure that we give very concrete strategies for how they can tackle those next aspects of the language. And finally, on this topic, when we're arranging the furniture, remember that some neurodiverse students really benefit from having just a little bit more elbow room so that they can work more comfortably. And it also helps them not to get in the way of their classmates and therefore maintain good relationships with them, which, as I said before, is the absolute foundation of a good inclusive classroom. And this leads us on to the second topic of the talk, which has to do with less concrete but equally important ways that teachers can influence and develop an inclusive culture in the classroom. First and foremost, we teachers need to model a respectful and accepting culture. We need to take time to really listen to the voices of all the learners and to value them and take the responsibility to make space for those students who are a bit shy or more reluctant to speak so that they have a say. We need to model good listening and turn-taking strategies and show that we expect everybody in the group to do the same. I always try to encourage my learners to see themselves as a group working towards the same goal rather than individuals working alone. When students work in pairs and groups, it gives them more time to practice the new vocabulary and the new structures. But we need to ensure that the pairs and the groups that we set up really do work well together. We need to take into account the talents and perhaps some of the difficulties that our learners may experience. And this is where getting to know the students really pays off. For some activities, it may be beneficial to group students who have different skills together. For example, students who have lots of ideas but are not so confident at writing them down would work well with students who are very confident writers but perhaps not so imaginative. So that in the end, what they produce is better than they could do on their own, and they all feel proud of what they've achieved through their pair work and group work. Even if we're not in control of the content to be taught, we can take control of the pace at which the lessons go. And of course, we need to balance moving at a lively and engaging pace, which keeps students motivated. We need to balance that with making sure students can follow comfortably. Neurodiverse students may process information a little more slowly than their classmates. So it may be worth calling some tasks core tasks that everybody needs to complete, and then have extension tasks that the quick finishers can move on to. We might decide to differentiate in terms of the tasks that we ask students to do or the materials that we ask them to use to do the task. We may differentiate in terms of what kind of support and how much support we offer. When we get to know our learners really well, we might differentiate in terms of what we expect from them, in terms of knowing when a student has done absolutely the best they can do and when we can just push them a little bit further and get a bit more out of them. The short-term memory spans of some neurodiverse learners is probably going to be a bit shorter than their classmates. So we need to try and build in a lot of opportunities for recapping and revising the new material. And we also need to encourage them to review between lessons, to work independently. And I do recommend investing a bit of classroom time in helping students to develop better memory strategies. Everybody in the class will benefit from this, and they will thank you later in life, even if they're not using their English on a daily basis. Helping students to understand how they work best is actually one of the most valuable things that we can do for our students. I'm sure we all encourage our learners to try and get organised and put their notes into folders and notebooks and so on. But neurodiverse learners might need actually a bit more guidance and a bit more support with this. They might even need some modelling to see how it's done. They might need some help with using a diary or the online calendar on their phones, depending on how old your students are. And again, these are skills which are vital for learning, but also will benefit them later in life when they start preparing for exams, even looking for work. And this leads me on to my final comments in this talk, where I want to think about the culture of the wider environment in which we're working. Our classrooms are just small parts of a much bigger education system. And what we do is influenced by the education system and the society in which we're working. As teachers working in the classroom with students, we can make changes within our classroom environment, within our practice, and we can contribute to a bottom-up transformation of the system. But for inclusive practices to really take hold, we need a top-down approach as well. So do feel that you can talk with your managers, even policymakers and external bodies like publishers and exam boards, because we all need to work together to make sure that we offer a much more inclusive experience. When you talk to your manager or head of school and you explain why you want to make changes in your classroom, or maybe you need some additional resources like the coloured overlays or the text windows, explain why you need it. And when they see the improvement in retention and achievement rates amongst your students, I'm sure they will get on board. Now, you might feel that as an individual teacher, you can't really affect what publishers or exam boards do, let alone policymakers. But in fact, you do have a powerful voice, particularly as customers of the big organisations' products. Why not write to them and tell them what you would like to see in your textbook, or how you would like the exam papers to be formatted, or even maybe the exam sessions could be run in a more efficient way? If enough of us do this, they will start to listen. And in fact, some of the really big international organisations are already starting to listen to us. So I started this talk by suggesting a few really practical changes that we could make in the physical environment of our classrooms, and also the classroom materials. And I then moved on to consider some more subtle ways of managing the classroom culture. And I hope that this has helped you to feel that actually including neurodiverse learners isn't that hard. And you can see maybe it's worth investing a bit of time to really get to know your learners, to find out what their strengths are, as well as the difficulties that you see. Help them to understand themselves and to get to know each other in the class, so that you create a really supportive and collaborative learning environment. And above all, my hope is that your inclusive classroom will have positive effects which spread to the wider community and encourage everybody to contribute in their own way to developing a more inclusive education system.